Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Thanks for coming. We've got an equipment issue tonight. The bulb went out here on the top, so we're using the projector at eye level here, my eye level. So pardon and that's why all the chairs are pushed to one side, so all of you don't block the screen like I am right here. And you know our story. We're always looking for donations because we write grants all the time. You still at it, Bob?
Still there.
Yeah,
We look for volunteers too.
we look for volunteers. So if you're interested, as the weather gets nicer, we'll look for people who are interested in working in it. We need people to willows, to pull invasives, and right now we're trying to raise money for fire mitigation. That's gonna be the big thing for 2026. And the speaker for January, his job is he's January 8th. His job is, what do they call it, cold fire. And what he does, you know, the burn piles you've seen in the woods? Well, instead of burning them, he's using mushrooms to eat them down. And then there's no fire, there's nothing hazardous to the environment. So he'll tell you all about that in January, but that's a really good solution.
To make it work.
We'll see.
Yeah.
In Northern Ireland.
Yes.
So we started in mushrooms. Whatever's available. Now, today we have Dan Preston from CSU. Where are you, Dan?
I'm standing behind you.
And he's talking about how the wildfires affected fish. But I looked on your website and it's all about invasives and all kinds of things. So thank you for coming. And you can tell these folks more about what you do.
Okay, sounds good, Celeste. Thanks for inviting me. So well, it's always fun to get a chance to share the work we do.
I'm glad you came.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'm a professor in the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology, and I moved out here from Madison, Wisconsin in December of 2020 during COVID, but also sort of the tail end of all the major wildfires that we had out here. And I remember when I visited Fort Collins, there was ash raining down from the sky, and I had my laptop open outside at one point, and a bunch of ash fell on my keyboard, and I came back to Wisconsin and I opened it and I found all this ash on my keyboard. And it was just a very it was a bizarre time to be moving back to Colorado because of COVID and also because of these fires. It was just kind of top of mind. But after doing that, I sort of had some opportunities to work on wildfire. So I'm an aquatic ecologist. I hadn't worked on fire before 2020, but because of that, you know, the timing was such that everybody was interested in fire and what it's doing. So yeah, like Celeste said, I'll talk a bit about how wildfire has affected our streams around here and also things like bugs and fish and some of the organisms we care about.
Good. Oh, yeah. Turn down the lights for the room. Thank you, Ashley.
Thanks. So a little bit of an outline is that I'll talk a little bit about how fires might burn in riparian areas around streams and things like beaver meadows. Some of the things we might expect to see happen in a general sense. And then I want to talk mostly one study, but also a little bit about the second study where we went out and evaluated a whole bunch of things about streams after the Cameron Peak and East Troublesome and Williams Fork fires, which were all in 2020. And then I'll wrap up maybe with some of the longer term effects, what might be happening in the next set of years after that. So these plots are just showing that a variety of factors related to wildfire have increased over time, especially in the last few decades. And so some of this is associated with climate change. When things are drier and warmer, we have potentially larger and more frequent fires. There's a lot of other human factors associated with that. But there have been a number of studies showing that over time, especially in the Western US, we're getting bigger fires and more frequent fires, unfortunately. So that seems to be what's happening. And a lot of folks study how fires influence our forests, and my interests are what's under the water primarily. So there are a handful of ways fires can interact with the streams themselves and also with the riparian areas. And I noticed that your coalition is doing some work related to stream restoration and beaver meadows and things like that. And so one of the real hot topics is how do those sort of activities affect fires? And it depends a lot on what's going on in the riparian area. But these are just all examples of different types of stream riparian areas in various elevations and parts of the Western US. And in some cases, the riparian areas burn pretty much the same as the rest of the forest. So this is a photo from Little Beaver Creek. This is near Pingree Park, if any of you are familiar with that area. So if you drive up the Highway 14 along the Pooter, you kind of get up into this area. And so in some cases, the fire simply burns all the way up to the stream, and that was the case. And you can see there's really no difference in the burn severity right along the stream, as it probably is a little bit higher up the slope. And so in some places along streams, you get that scenario, which can lead to pretty dramatic effects and changes in what's happening in the stream. But in some cases, the riparian areas may actually be fire breaks, or they might actually be a lot less susceptible to burning. And so this is an image that shows sort of more of a valley meadow scenario where you might get more swampy conditions around the stream. And because the water table is really high, you might have less intense burn severity right along the stream. And so that's partly why people are really excited about beaver dams and getting wet meadows to be connected to floodplains, like some of the work this coalition is doing, because that might potentially help when wildfire comes through. I think I have a photo or two of that sort of scenario on the next slide. This is just an example of a fire that burned in Washington State. And it's a little hard to see. This is an Olympic Peninsula, but the stream corridor is right here. And the fire burned right up to the edge of the stream corridor. And because this area was pretty wet and swampy, it didn't jump across. The fires we had in 2020 were so intense and fast moving that might not have occurred here. But there are areas nonetheless where those sorts of meadows are expected to really help with fire behavior. And this is just sort of an image of one of those sort of scenarios where the riparian corridor is helping prevent that fire from jumping across. And there are a few places in the Cameron Peak fire where we saw that kind of thing. One is if some of you are familiar with Rocky Mountain National Park, there's an area called Hay Creek, kind of close to the Cameron Peak side or the Pooter side. And there's a huge meadow there, and the fire burned really intense up on all the hills, but then down in that meadow, it didn't burn nearly as severely because it was so wet down there. So that's potentially a desirable attribute of fires burning around streams. And so, what we see in the stream will depend on those sorts of effects and what happens in the riparian. But in some cases, like again, this photo near here, we can lose all the trees, and that'll lead to loss of the canopy and much more light reaching the stream, and that can lead to increased temperatures in the stream potentially. And you also can get increased overland stream flow because the soils and the plants are changing so much from fire that they're not absorbing as much water. And so you might get much more water running over the surface. And so you can have increased stream flows and increased temperatures. Associated with that, you can get a lot of movement of organic matter and sediment and ash basically into the streams. This was an image from the Pooter where an ambitious kayaker decided to go down the Pooter during one of these events where we have a big rainstorm and that moves all this dark sediment and ash into the stream after fire. And so we've seen that sort of scenario quite a bit after the 2020 fires, where you get a really intense precipitation event and it just moves all this sediment and ash into the stream. You get this chocolate milk kind of looking scenario. And it's thought that these sorts of events, this is more of the same sort of scenario on Little Beaver Creek, which again is up Pingree Park Road, sort of near Pingree Park. And we were doing fieldwork out there one day and the stream was totally crystal clear. And then we had a rainstorm occur and just within minutes, it turned to this chocolate brown color, huge amounts of sediment were getting deposited. And we think it's often these sorts of events that may be killing fish and invertebrates, potentially more so than the initial fire. So it kind of depends on how hot things get due to the initial fire. But these events can lead to big, potentially at times die-offs of fish and things like that. So it may be these follow-up effects where you have fire and then you have these sort of floods and debris flow sort of events. And so we have some evidence that these sorts of things are problematic, especially for fish.
Dan, is all that debris from the fire then?
Yeah, it is really from the fire. So the rain would fall on sort of these slopes and then it starts to transport all of this stuff into the stream. And because the slopes no longer have vegetation to hold that stuff in place and the fire created all this burned material and sediment, it gets moved really readily into the stream. And at times this can lead to problems for fish, but at other times they might be resilient to it. And I think it probably depends on how intense and how frequent and how long it lasts. So one of the cases where this was really problematic was the most extreme example was in the Pooter watershed. There's a tributary called Black Hollow, and some of you probably heard how that had a huge event where we had all this precipitation and it created a debris flow that took out that little community down by the highway and killed a couple people. But that event killed all the fish in the Pooter downstream for several miles. And so the Colorado Parks and Wildlife biologists have surveyed on the Pooter, and after that occurred, it killed fish for quite a distance. And then they since have restocked and they've started to recover in the years since. But that was a really extreme example of this sort of thing on a big scale. And that was moving boulders and trees and houses. So it wasn't just sediment. That was really extreme. But these are sometimes the problems after fire for the stream critters. So, you know, you all know very well what happened in 2020. That was the worst fire year on record in the Western US. There's some statistics that something like 51,000 fires burned, something like 10 million acres just in the US. And the three largest fires since we've recorded it were all in 2020 in Colorado. And so that was Cameron Peak, over 200,000 acres, East Troublesome, that was almost as big, and then another fire a little further away, the Pine Gulch fire. And we also had the Williamsport fire at the same time, which was a little smaller, but that was burning in 2020 as well. And so this is just a really dramatic photo from here in Estes when that Cameron Peak fire started. So this is now a little about some of the studies we've done in relation to those fires. One of them was trying to understand right after the fires in 2021, the year following, how the streams have changed and how things like bugs and fish in the streams have changed after the fires. And so what we did was we picked streams that were sort of similar to one another, but one was inside the fire perimeter and one was just outside. And so that's what these points are, is a separate stream that we surveyed a whole bunch of variables at inside Cameron Peak and outside. And then we also had a pair down further south, kind of near Grammy, that was in and out of the East Troublesome, and then another pair down by the Williamsport. And so we wanted to just say at a very simplistic level, what are the differences between the streams that were burned and impacted and the ones just outside that were not. And we focused on a couple of different aspects of the stream. So one of the neat things about streams is that they're connected to the riparian zone through a whole bunch of different ways. And so this is sort of a food web diagram showing a few of those connections. And some of the ones that are of interest are through bugs. So bugs come out of the stream and then they feed things like birds and spiders. And then bugs also fly back in the stream and feed fish. And so those of us that fly fish, we often use either terrestrial bugs like grasshoppers can work, or sometimes the adult phases of mayflies and things that fall back in the stream or lay eggs and then get eaten by fish. And so I think on the next slide, you can see some boxes here. So we were interested in a study in these parts of the food web primarily. So what's going on with the trout, what's going on with the aquatic invertebrates, and then how is potentially the rate at which those invertebrates emerge out of the stream changing, because again, those provide food for all kinds of consumers. And in particular, we're interested in spiders because they eat those bugs that come out of the stream. So there are a couple of cool specialized spiders that build their webs right around the stream, and they're catching mayflies and caddisflies and things that come out of the water. So we were curious if the fire was affecting those bugs coming out, and then maybe those spiders that eat them, and then also the insects that fall in. So that includes the terrestrial things like beetles and grasshoppers and bees and things that provide a good amount of trout food, especially in the summer. So we were curious how those might be affected by the fire. And here's some images of those burned areas. And I talked about how sometimes the riparian can be a bit of a fire break if it's really wet and there's beaver meadows and things like that. But these sites were not like that. They were more narrow. They didn't have much of a riparian that prevented the fire from sweeping right through. So these are kind of dramatic photos that show, you know, the riparian zone was just completely burned at pretty much all of these sites right up to the stream. So potentially big increases in things like lights and other changes. And then if we take a look at the unburned sites, so again, these are just outside of those fire perimeters. And you can see those riparian areas look very different just because they haven't had a very recent fire. So those are sort of just visuals of the sites, and pretty small streams. You know, most of them are not particularly huge, but fairly small in size, kind of headwater type sites. And then a whole bunch of folks from CSU, including some collaborators and a bunch of students, went out and we measured all kinds of things to look at those different parts of the about before. So we looked at benthic invertebrates and we used nets to sample those on the bottom. We looked at emergent insects, and there's a cool way to do that with these funny looking traps where the bugs essentially come up into the center of this and then they get trapped. And then they end up falling into this jar right here at the home. And so then we just go and screw the jar and we get a bunch of caddisflies and stoneflies and things. We also put out these pan traps, they're called, which basically just collect bugs falling in. So if you're a trout sitting here, that's sort of a snapshot of what that trout might see at the surface. So we put those out. We did surveys for spiders, and those you have to do at night because the spiders build their webs every night and then they kind of go back and hide in the day. So we had to go out after sunset and do those, which was exciting. That's what that bottom photo is with the headlamps. And then we surveyed fish using electrofishing, so we can put on these backpack electroshockers and stun the fish, and that's non-lethal, so it kind of allows us to catch them and survey them, and then we can put them back in the stream. So it's not going to kill them, but it's a good way to figure out how many are there and what are their sizes and all that kind of stuff. And we measured a bunch of habitat stuff. We looked at sort of stream flows and the substrate and the algae and the canopy and how much burn occurred around the riparian and stuff like that, which would hopefully help us understand some of those possible changes.
And fish mainly feed on bugs?
They mainly feed on bugs, especially trout. I got a funny photo there of a brook trout that was very ambitious. That's a mouse that he was trying to eat. And we electroshocked that brook trout while he was trying to eat that mouse. Um, but mostly they eat bugs. The larger trout can eat things like sculpin and smaller fish, and occasionally other things that they can jam in their mouths, but mostly bugs. And I think is there a little video icon on that bottom right? I'm not sure if that's gonna work or not, but let's see if it does. Oh yeah, here's an example of how we see what they're eating. So that's just a straw of water, and we're just pumping water into their stomach, basically. And these are mostly, these are all chironomid midges, little tiny flies. And so that trout is eating a lot of chironomid midges. That's pretty gross, right?
Well, it's even to get it back.
It doesn't get it back, no. Unfortunately, we stole that whole meal. But we know that these chironomid midges, they only last in their stomachs for something like 6 or 8 hours. So it ate all those pretty quickly. So it would probably just go back and eat a whole bunch of those again. But we did steal that meal from that brown trout. So that was part of what we did. We caught these fish that were anesthetized, and then we can get them to sort of barf up all their stomach contents, and then you get this interesting little gift in the tray, and we take that back to the lab, and we can sort through all the stomach contents to try to get a sense for what they're eating. And then the fish gets released and probably is very confused about what just happened, but it doesn't.
You guys had a really good time putting that slide together.
Yeah. One of my technicians posted this on Reddit. I don't even use Reddit. I don't know exactly what it is. It's like an online forum thing. And he said that video got like 1,000 comments or something. Probably the best outreach our lab has done.
So was the mouse in the water?
You know, the mouse, what was weird was we electroshocked that brook trout with that mouse hanging out of its mouth. And so that net in the background was what it was scooped out of the water with. So it was trying to get that mouse down, but it wasn't successful because it was so big. And I've come across brown trout with a garter snake half inside of them, and the inside of the half inside of the brown trout was digested, the half was hanging out, and he was just digesting it slowly with it hanging out. So I think they're sometimes more ambitious than they can actually consume. I don't think that brook trout would have been successful in eating that. I think it was a mouse or a vole or something. But it was trying. And people fish, with mouse patterns, and usually you're trying to catch a rainbow trout that's about this big, not a brook trout that's this big, but
Are you
sometimes.
studying the food sources in terms of their impacts in the streams also post-fire?
We did some work on the bugs directly. Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna show a couple slides on the bugs. Yeah, we were interested in that as well. So is the fire affecting the abundance or the composition of those things? Yeah. Yep. Yep, actually, here's the slide of exactly that. So that was a well-timed question. So I have a few of these plots that are similar in that they have this gray box, and that was those unburned sites, and then this orange box is the burned areas. And so again, this was just the first year after the fires in 2021. So the Cameron Peak fire, it burned, I think, until maybe November. It burned into the fall. So this would have been then the following July. So less than a year after, fairly soon after. And these plots show, this one is density. So this is just the number of bugs on the bottom of the stream. And what we saw there was, in relation to the burn sites, you had maybe twice the density. So there were far more, twice as many roughly macro on the bottom of the stream at those sites that didn't have the fire. Yeah.
I'm ignorant, what's benthic?
That's a great question. Benthic just means the bottom of a water body. So the benthic zone of a stream is in the gravel and the rocks and the cobble. But you could say the benthic zone of a lake or a marine area, same thing, just the bottom. We like to come up with silly names for simple things. Yeah, so this one is just the density numbers in an area. This one is the biomass. So that incorporates both how many and how big they are. And it actually is less of an effect when you look at the biomass, there isn't as much of a difference. And then this is the number of taxonomic groups, so how many different species are in there. And it's not actually species, it's more like families, because some of these are really hard to identify, especially the flies. But what we saw was a little bit less richness, a little bit fewer in those burned areas, but not as dramatic as you might expect. So to some degree, when you look at those streams that have all the trees burned, you think, oh, there's no way anything's alive in there right now. But what we found was there's fewer insects, but there's still plenty. So that was a little bit eye-opening to us that it wasn't quite as dramatic maybe as we might have expected just by looking at it, because it looks like something, you know, pretty dramatic happened. And then this is a slide of those insects that come out of the stream and the insects that come in. And so again, those ones coming out are food for birds and bats and spiders. And then the ones coming back in are food for trout that are sometimes looking up. And what we found there was that there wasn't a dramatic difference. So this upper image is one of those emergence traps. So I said you put a little jar there and then all the insects end up in the jar. And so what you see there are all the adult flies. There's some caddis flies in there. There's some stone flies. So basically we measure all that stuff and we determine how much of it is coming out over time. And then that's what actually this part of the plot is. So that's aquatic insects emerging. This is terrestrial insects coming in. So that's like our grasshoppers and beetles and bees and all that kind of stuff. And then this is the aquatic insects that emerge out of the stream, but then they end up coming back in because most of them come back to lay their eggs. So mayflies and caddisflies and stoneflies, the adults will come out and mate, and then many of them end up dead back in the stream when they're reproducing. And that's why we go fishing. Sometimes we'll use a adult caddisfly or stonefly or whatever, because they come back in. And so the net result though was that there wasn't actually much of a change in this. So that was maybe not what we expected, which is perhaps a good sign though. And then I mentioned that we were interested in these spiders. So these guys are the main species or group that eat these insects that come out. And they love to build their webs sort of horizontal to the water surface. So if there's overhanging trees, they'll put a web right there and then they'll catch all those insects coming out. And what we found with these spiders is there were way fewer of them at those sites that had experienced pretty severe fire. And so the question with that was, is that due to just a change in the habitat, or is it due to their loss of food? And we hypothesized that it would be due to loss of food, but in that previous slide, I showed that there wasn't a big dramatic difference in the insects coming out. And so we think that might have just been more of a habitat thing, that when the riparian zone burned, it changed their habitat so much and may have killed off a lot of them and they haven't recolonized quite yet, just in this first year after fire. So maybe more of a habitat thing and a mortality thing than lack of having food. And then here's some results for the fish. So I mentioned that we would go in electroshock. And so these are a bunch of brook trout that are not dead. They are anesthetized, so we can kind of knock them out, and then we can measure and weigh them and do that lavage process where we get them to throw up their stomachs. And this first plot is a measure of relative abundance, and it says fish per minute. And we scaled it that way because we would go electroshock with the crew, and then we could calculate how many trout did we catch per minute of electroshocking. And so that's a measure of how many are in the stream that's somewhat standardized. And when we did that, we found that at the burn sites, we generally have lower, maybe roughly half as many fish as at those unburned sites. So this is just a snapshot right after the fire, but there's some evidence that the burned streams had lower numbers of fish. And I'll show one other sort of related study that found the same kind of general pattern right after the fire. And then the other thing we noticed was the sizes of those fish were pretty different between the burned and unburned sites. So this other plot shows how big the fish are in millimeters, and then how many fell in those different size classes. And that upper gray plot is the unburned streams, and then the lower panel is the burned ones. And what you see is that those unburned streams, we have many more small fish, whereas at the burn sites, we generally have larger fish. And what we think is going on is that those smaller fish are particularly susceptible to some of the impacts of fire when all that sediment and stuff comes through. So what we think is we're probably losing more of the small fish, whereas the big fish are more resilient to those sorts of disturbances. That's what we think is going on. And then the other piece of that is that the big fish tend to move more. So they potentially recolonize more quickly. So if an area gets burned and you lose a lot of fish, the first ones that come back in may tend to be the larger ones. And so we think that might also be contributing to that pattern.
So you had mentioned about restocking the fish, and there's a die-off.
Yeah.
This may seem like a silly question, but
No.
do they ever like recolonize spiders? Do they, where there's
Oh.
cows, will they bring in like some of their food sources?
You know,
and spider
there's not enough interest in spiders, I think, for anybody to be doing that. Yeah, so with
I think
fish,
they're cool, but.
yeah, I mean, with fish, the state is restocking them in some areas or interested in restoring native cutthroats and things, but there's nobody that I know of doing that with spiders, but maybe you guys could start. Yeah.
Dan, fish take oxygen from the water, right?
Yeah.
So does the oxygen level go down with a fire?
That is a great question. And what we think is happening is that the sediment pulses that come through, the reason they might be dying from that is potentially what you're describing, that they're unable to respire with their gills, and that sediment may be essentially clogging up their ability to do that physiologically, but it also might reduce oxygen levels in the water when stuff decomposes. And streams are usually fairly well oxygenated, but when you get those big pulses, that can change the oxygen levels. So we think it's sort of a stress thing related to the sediment could maybe clog up their gills and their ability to respire, and then if the oxygen does go down, that might take them out. And so I mentioned on the pooter, the black hollow debris flow killed all the fish for literally like, I can't remember, it might have been 6 or 8 miles downstream of that. The fish were just wiped out. And it was probably those sorts of things that did it in that event. Yeah. So when we did all this work to look at their stomach contents, what's interesting or of note is this was just a snapshot on the day we are out there doing the surveys, and the diets of fish change a lot over the seasons, and they change based on what might be emerging or what sort of hatching insects is going on. But we did this just with a snapshot, and at the time we did it, we didn't find a particularly big difference in the stomach contents of the burned and unburned sites. So those fish, you know, it appears that they were finding enough food, they were eating roughly similar things. So this plot is the burned sites and unburned, and then this is the proportions of all these things. And this is just the flies, the mayflies. These are sort of the true insects that are mostly terrestrial. Caddisflies, stoneflies, other terrestrial insects, worms, and then a few other things like beetles and mites. But they were eating a lot of this stuff. We did find earthworms in a lot of them at the burn sites, and we hypothesized maybe earthworms are getting flushed into those streams more readily, but it wasn't a very large difference. So that's good news. It suggests that these sites that got heavily affected, you know, they still probably have enough bugs for the most part to keep those fish going. So we didn't see a dramatic difference there. And then that's just a photo of one of these. This is a cutthroat trout. One of the sites we did have cutthroat trout that's over by Joe-Wreck Reservoir on near Highway 14. And that's all the good stuff that came out of that little guy. Yeah, they eat a lot. I think I have that same photo again, just because I got such a kick out of that. That was from the Rocky Mountain National Park, Mummy Pass Creek. which was a really brutal hike to get to, but we surveyed the top of the Mummy Pass there up high, and that's where we found that little guy. So, you know, we've been back to a lot of these sites that we worked at in 2021. And I have a few photos where I really made an effort to get the same spot in 2023. And I want to do this again. I didn't do it last summer, but maybe we'll do it again next year. But what's of note is just that the vegetation has bounced back pretty quickly. So if we were to go back to this site now, you know, the things, it varies between locations, but things like the aspen have a big rootstock underneath, and they tend to bounce back really fast because they're adapted and the roots usually don't die. A lot of this riparian stuff that we see coming in is mostly sort of herbaceous or forbs and grasses and stuff. And in some cases, the willows bounce back pretty fast, depending on how heavily they were sort of burned in their roots. Sometimes they get killed. And then the conifers are bouncing back, but it depends a lot on sort of where their seed can come from and how far away was it all burned. And so that might take longer to regenerate, and it's really variable depending where you are in the burn scar. But I thought these photos were sort of, you know, optimistic view of how quick some of the vegetation is coming back. And so if I had a photo now from this past summer, it would look even dramatically different than this. But, you know, this first summer, these such sites just look so bleak, but you get quite a bit of regeneration pretty quick. And here's just some more of these interesting photos. And this is a fish creek. It's not the same fish creek that there's a project that your coalition is leading, but it's a fish creek over by the Pingree Park Road. So as you're driving up to Pingree Park, it's sort of on the right-hand side as you're getting towards, not all the way up to Mountain Campus, but sort of on that road up there.
Were you measuring like sediment differences over the years, or was it mostly initially right after the fire?
You know, that's a great question. I haven't worked on that directly. There's a bunch of folks at CSU that are working on that sort of stuff. And the sediment transport, it's a little bit complicated because it depends on weather events, and it depends on how quick things stabilize the sediment around the streams. And so I think the gist is you get a lot of that right after fire. It starts to peter off as things grow back. But if you have a huge precipitation event, you can still get a huge influx of the sediment a year or 2 or 3 years after. And we saw some of that kind of stuff. I think I have a slide showing a few of the more dramatic events. But my guess is it tapers off with years after fire, but it depends on regeneration and it depends on weather events. And also the aspect, like if you have really steep slopes around that stream that are going to erode more readily, that's going to lead to big pulsed events, whereas if it's more gradual, maybe it's not as dramatic and things like that. So it's kind of variable, but definitely a lot right after fire. And you can see this stuff. All of this dark stuff here is sediment that came from somewhere upstream and it was just deposited on the shores. Like it's really fine, and it's kind of a mix of sand and burned stuff, and it gets moved around pretty easily. And that's what can create problems for drinking water and fish and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So I want to briefly mention one other study that is fish focused. So myself and another faculty member, Yoichiro Kano, who's a fish biologist, did some work with the park, Rocky Mountain National Park. And so just to orient you, we're here in Estes, and then the park had a bunch of sites within the fire perimeter of the Cameron Peak and the East Troublesome fires, where there was either some existing fish data or they had interest in surveying those streams after the fire. And so a couple of them are up in the headwaters of the Big Thompson, a couple of them are in the Colorado River system around Grand Lake and Shadow Mountain, and then the rest of them are over here in the headwaters. This is the headwaters of the Pooter, and you know, that's the Pooter drainage over there. So we have a few sites in all three of those watersheds. And these sites were pretty variable in how much they burned. So this is Mummy Pass, where that little brook trout came from with the mouse in its stomach. And you can see back up here, there was a lot of high burn severity, but then down in the meadow where the creek is, the riparian didn't burn nearly as much. So this is a site where, you know, we might expect effects of the fire from upstream, but because the riparian is intact, maybe a lot less dramatic effects possibly at a site like that. And then in contrast, here's one on Hazeline Creek. So this is that Hay Creek meadow. It's kind of hard to orient yourself, but this is an entrance to the park over here from Highway 14, where you can hike up into this Hay Creek meadow. And then above that meadow, there was a site that looked like this. And so comparing that to that Mummy Creek site, you know, really different. They're both in the fire perimeter, but totally different scenarios in terms of what the stream was experiencing right there. And so that's a narrow, steep valley, fire burned really high intensity all the way through the stream. And so you might expect that would have a lot more mortality of fish and things like that.
Was that a 2021 photo?
Yeah, this is right after the fires in 2021, before much regeneration. But I actually went up here with some friends and we went backpacking up here. So there's a trail that kind of goes along the Hay Creek Meadow and then goes to a lake. Is it Emerald Lake? I think it might be Emerald Lake, I'm forgetting. But when we hiked up the slope here, you know, there was some regeneration, but it's still a pretty dramatic moonscape kind of. So there's some small plants, but I think the regeneration there, you know, it can be affected by how arid the slope is and the aspect and the seed sources for trees and things like that. So it's really variable, I think, how things are coming back, how fast, and it's kind of patchy. So very different scenarios for these two sites in the park. And then if we summed up all those sites though, so this was, I can't remember, something like 20 some sites with a few in the Poudre headwaters, a few in the Colorado headwaters, and then a few in the Big Thompson headwaters. And what we saw was that the abundances of fish dropped quite a bit in that first year after fire. But then by just 1 year after, in 2022, they actually bounced back to almost what they were like prior to fire. And so this was interesting in that it suggested that those fish populations may be having sort of transient short-term effects, but in some cases they're bouncing back pretty fast. And this was sort of based on all those sites, something like 20 some sites. And this was all the fish, just the large fish, and then just the small fish. And what we think is happening is to some degree, there was a student at CSU working on this, and what he was trying to figure out was, are they bouncing back due to reproduction, or are they just moving back in? Like, are they moving out of the burned areas, but then recolonizing? And he found evidence that they are moving out of the burned areas and then just coming back to some degree. So it's probably a combination of they're dying, but then some of them are just experiencing bad conditions, moving into unburned parts of the watershed, and then they are simply moving back. There's some of that happening too. And reproduction is likely starting up again, but there's definitely some degree of movement that's driving this pattern. And that's why it's important that we have areas of the watershed, ideally, that are not getting burned. And, you know, that's not always in our control, but if we can set up scenarios where maybe there's meadows and places where we're hoping fire doesn't get to, they can be refugia for fish, and then they'll recolonize from those sorts of areas. So this is promising in that it seems like relatively short-term effect.
How does that compare with, I know there's a lot of stocking of rivers.
So those data were all from sites that have not been stocked. So I'm going to say at least recently. So there's been tons of movement of brook trout and brown trout and rainbow trout, which are all not native. And a lot of that happened 100 years ago plus in this area. And so those species have been established in a lot of those sites. But those data were not due to stocking. The Poudre, the main stem Poudre, is managed for recreational fishery. And so the state did restock that with rainbow trout, especially. And it was a lot of brown trout, and then the fire knocked a lot of them out, and then the state came in and decided to try rainbow trout in the main stem pooter, and so they did restock. But those sites have not been stocked. Yeah,
I have a related question, on the previous slide.
yeah,
It's all trout,
yes,
large trout, but not differentiated
by species.
by species.
This was all trout group, and what I would say is the vast majority of these sites support brook trout. And there was maybe a couple sites, like the headwater sites on the Colorado, that supported brown trout. But usually when you get up high enough and the streams get small enough, you get almost exclusively brook trout. And so most of these sites were all brook trout with a couple brown trout mixed in. And the other part of this is that a lot of these sites were in the areas of the Pooter Headwaters project where we're trying to remove brook trout and reintroduce native cutthroat trout. And so these particular sites didn't already support cutthroat because brook trout had been introduced and they usually outcompete them. And so, you know, the loss of these brook trout is sort of, it depends on what lenses you're looking at. If you're interested in native cutthroat conservation, maybe that's not a bad thing. But at the same time, these brook trout provide lots of recreational angling in the park. And so there are people that are interested in them. But part of the reason they're not restocking these sites, at least some of them, is because they're in the Pooter Headwaters project and we're gonna go in and remove those brook trout anyway. And some of that work is already starting in the last few years because there's interest in getting rid of the brook trout, reintroducing native cutthroat trout. Yeah, good questions. So then the question is, what are we thinking we might see in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years in these areas? And so this is sort of zooming out, not to our data, but to other fires. And what tends to happen over time is that these areas where the trees have died, you'll start to get those to fall down. And so in some places, you might actually get more wood entering the stream. And in general, wood does good things for fish habitat. And so as these trees die, they already are dead, but as they start to fall in, you might get more wood recruitment to the streams, and that leads to more habitat complexity in pools and things that generally are pretty good for fish. So that might actually be not a bad thing at all. And then the other thing that you tend to have over time is more nutrients get in the stream. And whether this is good or bad depends a lot on what you're interested in the context, but these are data for nitrate over time. And there tends to be this interesting pattern where you get more nitrate in the years after fire, and it sort of builds up over time. So these are data from the Cannery Peak fire from a colleague at the Forest Service. And the interests here in nitrate are related to water quality for things like drinking water, but that also increases in nitrate and also phosphorus might fuel algae growth in the streams. And so whether this is good or bad depends on how high it gets and what you're interested in. But what's interesting is we do tend to see after fire, you can get higher nutrients, more algae, which is food for bugs, which can lead to better trout growth and more trout. And so the next slide shows that pattern for a different fire in Idaho. But this was 2.5 years after fire. These researchers in Idaho and mountain streams, kind of like ours, just went out and looked at the sizes of the cutthroat trout and found that on average they were bigger at these burn streams that had burned 2.5 years earlier. And they also measured algae and they measured bugs, and they found that those sites that had burned had more algae, which was providing more bugs, which was feeding cutthroat trout. And so what's interesting about this is it might take a few years, and we don't yet have great evidence for this here in Colorado. We have a little bit of evidence that the algae might be increasing as of last summer, but we don't yet have great evidence it's benefiting fish. But the hypothesis is that it may be benefiting fish in the coming years because you get more light, you get more nutrients, and that can make the stream more productive, and you might get faster fish growth. So that could be a good thing. Yeah.
I know algae, has a lot of oxygen in order for it to develop itself. Is that slower to do in Colorado because of with altitude not having as much oxygen in the air and stuff?
Oh, that's interesting. My guess is that our streams are well oxygenated because of the physical turbulence, because we have steep gradients and waterfalls and riffles. And so I don't know that that's necessarily a problem. It's a little outside my wheelhouse, but I don't think that's limiting. What I think is often limiting algae around here is cold conditions. You can get scouring from floods that just dislodges the algae and sends it downstream. So high flows, cold conditions, and then lack of nutrients, because some of our streams here are very low nutrient. So if they don't have enough nitrate and phosphorus to grow, and then you have scouring during snowmelt, you might have relatively low algae levels. So, this is one of those things where we're still curious if this is going to happen in Colorado, and if so, how long will it take, and all that kind of stuff. But there's potential for these sorts of effects. And what's interesting is we have colleagues out in Oregon, and 2020 was a bad fire season in Oregon too. It burned a bunch of places in old growth temperate forests that rarely burn, like around the Cascades and the Willamette Valley. There were huge fires. But what they found was these effects occurred almost instantly, and they saw much less fish mortality out there. They instead saw the fires increase fish growth and densities. And that's, they think, in part because out there the canopy is so dense compared to Colorado. There's always big conifers and cedars and Doug firs. And when the fire opens the canopy a little bit, it lets more light in, and then you get these nutrient effects, and it causes increased productivity in the stream. So what they saw in the first few years after fire were the burn streams had more fish and bigger fish, and they even found some aquatic amphibians that live in those areas were doing really well. So the story out there was pretty different than out here, where we saw some die-offs of fish. They actually saw the fish did great after the fire. But I think it's because Oregon is different than Colorado in terms of the canopy and how steep the stream is and all these other things. But it's a kind of a neat comparison.
So didn't you find that the larger fish survive better?
Yeah.
In Colorado?
Yeah.
So there were more bigger, like average fish was larger.
The average fish were larger, and we think that's, at least in the first year, that was, we think, more due to the loss of small fish rather than those fish growing faster. But now over the next few years, we might expect to see the fish growing faster, and the streams possibly can support more fish. But it's going to be dependent on these effects of light and nutrients to algae to bugs to fish. So if we see that pathway, that food web effect, we might get this. But if we don't see that, maybe there's not going to be a boost, and we don't know yet. We'll have to see.
I got a question from online. It says, were fish consumption advisories needed for the areas where fire swept through riparian stream areas post-fire?
Ooh, that's a great question. No, the short answer is not, to my knowledge. So when we get fish consumption advisories, often that's related to mercury. And there is some research showing, or starting to show, that wildfire may mobilize mercury and cause increased mercury levels in fish, but we don't, I don't know that we have enough evidence that anybody put out those sort of advisories. Like, we didn't have data to suggest that, or that those effects were strong enough. Mercury is complicated because it can get deposited from the atmosphere into streams through dust, and it can come from really far away, but it can also get locked up in biomass of plants, and then when that burns, it might enter streams and get into the food web that way. But I don't think we know quite enough to know if we should be doing that. My guess is it wasn't enough of a risk that the state needed to do that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question.
One more question.
No,
Yeah.
2 minutes.
What's that?
Just giving you a 2-minute warning.
Oh, okay.
2 minutes, no, no.
True, I went too long. I'm almost done, I think. So a couple of the take-home points were that, there might be a lot of good things about these broad meadows, and especially beaver areas, in terms of providing refugia from fire relative to these really steep areas. So this is Hay Creek that I talked about in hockey. So those areas could be really important to fish and other organisms. And then somebody asked about the sediment transport and events after fire. And so these are examples. This was the Black Hollow event that unfortunately killed a few people and caused this huge mortality in the Pooter. And you can see how dramatic that event was. This was another one in the Cameron Peak called Buckhorn Canyon that I think also unfortunately killed one or two people, but that was a big debris flow event. And so these occurred in years 1 and 2 after fire. And so, you know, the effects are gonna potentially persist as long as these big events sort of happen, but we've had fewer of these over time as we get further from fire. But it's not like it's just the first year. It could be a year or two later where you get these sorts of things. And again, it depends on the steepness of the slopes and the vegetation recovery, and then getting a huge precipitation event in those areas that kind of lines up with that stuff. So to kind of wrap up, we talked a little about this, how, you know, mortality of these fish may have implications for restocking or reintroduction, and most of what I talked about was non-native brook trout and some brown trout. So if we lose those, you know, maybe that's not terrible if it's in areas where we need to reintroduce cutthroat anyway, but it depends on who's there and where it is. And this point that even in these really burned areas, we were still finding fish is a good one. You know, when you look at it, you think nothing's in there, but when we look closely, we were still finding fish in these sites that burned pretty bad. That's a good thing. And then lastly, I keep showing that same photo. And then this is a site near Granby and Grand Lake that had a lot of cool wildflowers that regenerated really fast and tons of aspens. Yeah, fireweed. And so the fish are recovering due to immigration. They're coming back in, they're reproducing. Connectivity to areas that didn't burn as much is really important. And we're seeing vegetation return, insects return. And then lastly, these sort of nutrient blight effects may lead to better fish growth, but we're still trying to see if that's happening. Don't know yet. I think that might be one of the last. So yeah, we kind of covered most of this. Some areas saw a lot of mortality, but the good news is even those really heavily burned sites had some fish. They're coming back. And so fishing opportunities for these guys are still there in most places. Not to say that I would necessarily go to the heavily burned areas to fish, but there's still going to be fish in there. And as we get further away from 2020, things are probably looking better and better for fishing. So I think that's about it. This is just a way too complicated model, but it's just showing how all these things change over time. And so if you have a year of fire, things are going to differ in years 2, 5, and 10 after fire. And we're going to get differences in light, and differences in bugs, and differences in fish. So these things are really not static, but to some degree, the worst effects are probably starting to pass. And now we're entering more of this phase where things are bouncing back. And hopefully we don't get another big fire anytime soon in this area. Yeah, so thank you guys. Those are all the students and folks that have been involved. Lots of great students at CSU. And then I think that next slide is just some of the different groups that have funded some of the work over the years, and some of the agencies that have funded it. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I have one question.
Yes.
So I'm imagining the fire is burning
Yeah.
and close to the water
Uh-huh.
and like I'm imagining the water's boiling.
Yeah.
So are the fish able to sense the temperature going up?
You know, it's a great question. And the short answer is we don't really know. So there were some temperature loggers serendipitously out at a few sites before the fires. And I can't remember if I had a colleague that was, I think, recovering those. I can't remember if he ever got data back. But we really don't know if that's happening. So if the entire catchment is burning, you could envision a scenario where you get mortality right during the fire because it just gets so hot. But I think it depends how fast it moves through, if the headwaters are burning above. So I don't know is the short answer, but it's plausible you could get fish dying during the fire. But I think it also could be plausible that it's not getting as hot as we think. if, you know, there's an upstream lake or there's burned area, less burned areas upstream, you know, it's hard to know, but I think it's possible. Yeah, but we don't know. We can't send undergrads in during the fire to sample.
You can get the stupid ones too.
Well, maybe, yeah, fortunately. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.
Thanks for the invite.
Yeah.
Yep.